Our webinar today will introduce the concept of green chemistry. We have 3 green chemistry champions, a chemical manufacturer, a pharmaceutical manufacturer, and a product manufacturer, who will be discussing their efforts to build awareness and make a case within their firms and to their suppliers and customers about the value of green chemistry, the environmental value, the performance value, and the economic value. They'll discuss challenges and models to build momentum for green chemistry education, innovation across our firms. We have 3 amazing speakers, as I mentioned. Helen Holder, who is a Corporate Material Selection Manager at Hewlett-Packard. Tse-Sung from Genentech, the Program Manager for Environment, Health, and Safety. And Andy Shafer, who is the Executive Vice President for Sales and Market Development at Elevance Renewable Sciences. So with that, let me introduce again Helen Holder, who will be talking about the value of green chemistry to business in the electronics sector at her firm, Hewlett-Packard. Thank you very much, Helen.
Great. Thanks, Joel. So I'm going to be talking about the value of green chemistry to business, and we're starting from the downstream user side. So although HP does have chemists working on doing formulation in-house, the majority of the materials that we deal with are actually incorporated into our hardware products, and so I'm going to be mostly speaking from that perspective. So why is HP this interested in green chemistry? HP has a very long history of working on environmental issues, but the main impetus right now comes from the EU directive, the Ross Directive, which is the restriction on the use of certain hazardous substances in electrical and electronic equipment. Now, the Ross Directive was published about 10 years ago, and it was a companion law to the WE Directive, which is the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive. And these 2 directives were intended to work together in a very complementary way. And the WE Directive was intended to reduce the electronics waste that was going into the waste stream, and then the Ross Directive was intended to reduce the toxicity of the e-waste that was in the waste stream. This was a really important law that changed really everything about how we approached materials in our hardware products. The Ross Directive restricted 6 substances: lead, mercury, cadmium, hexavalent chromium, and 2 brominated flame retardants. The lead restriction in particular was very, very high impact because that restricted the use of tin lead solder, which is really the most important material in pretty much every piece of electronics out there, because solder holds everything together and provides all of the electrical connections between all of the different components. So the Ross Directive reached right into the heart of the hardware and removed this critical material, and we had to find a replacement for that material. So when we were looking at alternatives to these restricted substances, we used some fairly traditional methods of assessing them. We looked at cost, performance, reliability, manufacturability. And as an industry, all unregulated substances were treated as equally acceptable. And so we got to July 2006, and everyone was, very happy and said, okay, great, we're never going to have to think about this ever again. Only that wasn't quite the way it worked out. As it turns out, substance restrictions are really now a major class of regulation for finished electronics, and actually products in general, especially with the REACH regulations, where articles have been brought into scope of chemical regulations, regulations that in the past would not have affected finished products like electronics. So what we're seeing is more substances being under scrutiny and in more jurisdictions, and a lot more reporting. So in that case, it turns out that there's a pretty good business case for finding alternatives to restricted substances that are not likely to come under scrutiny by regulators in the future. As it turns out, replacing materials is very, very expensive. And so you don't want to be having to pay that transition cost over and over for the same application. You can think of it as an ATM fee. You can go to the ATM every day and pay an ATM fee, or you can get out all the money that you need for the week at the beginning and only pay 1 fee. And that's very similar to this, the transition costs. the funny part is that that cost actually stays the same even if the materials themselves cost the same. The replacement material can be at cost parity, but you still have to pay the transition cost to qualify parts, to do analytical testing, to track compliance, and so on. We also want to avoid unintended consequences, so we don't want to have a case where we get rid of a carcinogen only to introduce an aquatic toxicant or have some other burden shifting going on. And really, it's just common sense that if you're going to go to the trouble of getting rid of a substance specifically because it has an environmental or human health impact, you should make sure the replacements have a lower impact. So it's just common sense, although interestingly, not common practice just yet, but it just makes sense to do that. Now, the regulators are catching on to this as well. As we've seen BanBills come into play where a single substance gets restricted, we are seeing a lot of very clever chemistry happening where that molecule gets modified in some very small way, big enough so that it's a different chemical for the purposes of, say, assigning a CAS number, but small enough so that they're virtually indistinguishable from a functional and maybe toxicology perspective. And so we're seeing a lot of replacement of restricted substances with virtually identical substances. And the regulators are now starting to scrutinize this a little bit more. And we're seeing in a couple of jurisdictions alternatives assessment being built into the restriction process itself. So we're seeing that in the EU, in the Ross 2 methodology, which requires alternatives assessment, in California in the Safer Consumer Products Regulation, which requires alternatives assessment, and then in a couple of other jurisdictions in some other ways, Washington State and Maine. So what do these trends mean for green chemistry? What we see is that as more chemicals are restricted and scrutinized, companies are going to be, I think, much more interested in choosing lower impact alternatives as part of their risk mitigation strategy. This idea of, well, let's change it once, let's fix it once, we don't want to ever go back to that application again and have to do another substitution. And what that means is that green chemistry then becomes a business opportunity for suppliers. Now, what we've found is that if we don't articulate environmental requirements to our suppliers, we don't get better materials. If we don't ask for it, we don't get it. And interestingly, a lot of times these suppliers will actually even have these options available to us, but unless we ask for them, they don't bring them out. They don't come to us and say, hey, we have a halogen-free material or a phthalate-free material. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our supply chain. So if you look at this image on the right, this is kind of a model that I sometimes use to describe what's going on. HP has a very, very complicated supply chain. We have, just to give you a sense of the scale, we sell somewhere between 40 and 50 million computers a year, about 50 million printers a year, and about 2.5 million servers a year. We have many, many direct suppliers, and then, of course, each one of the products that we have has thousands of components in it, so there are many vendors underneath that as well. So it's a very complicated supply chain. When we go to a direct supplier and ask for something like, you know, better materials or whatever, a lot of times those direct suppliers don't actually have the engineering control to make those changes. And if we try to push that through our supply chain, generally what gets to the formulators is a single message, which is lower cost. Sometimes, no matter what we say, it always translates into lower cost by the time it gets to them. So what we've done in some of these key cases is we're jumping over most of the supply chain and going directly to the formulators. There's a smaller number of them, and we get to have these good direct conversations about what we need in the future materials. And we have used this approach actually with other things in addition to environmental, and it tends to work pretty well for us. What we're trying to do in that engagement is to influence what's on the menu to everyone in between us in the supply chain so that everything going into that pipeline already meets our requirements. So what do we do in those engagements? We do some things like we introduce green chemistry tools and metrics to formulators. So tying this back to this idea of green chemistry education is that a lot of times what we find is that the practicing chemists in a lot of these suppliers actually don't have any training in what we would think of as formal green chemistry. Now, if you explain these ideas to them, they do understand atom economy and so on, but they really haven't had it in a coherent way. That's just not the way they were trained, for example. Now, the great part is that we're finding that a lot of them are actually very receptive to it, and it definitely meshes with a lot of the efforts that they maybe already have inside their companies. But we're trying to introduce the ideas, the tools, and some of you will recognize on the right side here, green screen as sort of almost as really more of a metric of how successful are you being at creating a benign substance, for example. Now, to incentivize within the supply chain the uptake of those better materials, we also create white lists and procurement guides that we can provide now. Used to be just inside the company, but we are now able to share in the supply chain. So we have one that two that we've just released, one for flame retardants and one for plasticizers. And those are great. They're not as binding as an approved material list. We do have those as well. But now we're able to sort of differentiate, we would prefer this, we would prefer that you not use this, those sorts of preferences. And we find that our suppliers generally act on that. They appreciate the fact that our teams, which do have the technical skill to do those assessments, are able to give them that information, because a lot of times they don't have the skill in-house to do it. And then from the formulator and raw material suppliers, we generally try to encourage the design of the green chemistry, green materials from the beginning, so that we reduce the cost adders and don't have to go back and rework materials. Now, I would just like to wrap up by saying, so that's, I think, from the materials perspective, but a supplier, especially who's doing formulation, will need to do more. Everyone in our supply chain will be asked to do more over the next several years, and a lot of these things will be tied to green chemistry. Anyone who's doing chemical production will definitely have additional operational requirements. So the EH&S of the manufacturing processes themselves will be under a lot of scrutiny. Energy and carbon for processes and transportation will have to be reported through pass-downs. There's a lot of interest in water use right now and raw material sourcing. So we're seeing that conflict minerals are sort of the leading edge of that interest in sourcing, but I think that's a general trend we're going to see. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more reporting, and then as we get a better sense of where the hot spots are for each of those issues within our supply chains, I think there's going to be pressure to kind of improve those areas and raise the bar. And I think that green chemistry is going to be a part of maybe improving some of these. So, for example, if you have a hot spot of waste or emissions in a particular part of the supply chain, that's an obvious opportunity for green chemistry to come in and help maybe re-engineer that process or mitigate the waste and emissions from it. So from a downstream user, that's what it looks like to us and in terms of green chemistry and the value of it to business.
Great. Thanks so much, Helen. That was a fabulous way to start the presentation. Now we'll pass on to Tse-Sung, who will talk about his efforts at Genentech.
Thanks so much, everyone. Okay, let me go ahead and get started. So let's see if I just click. Great. So I just want to talk very briefly more about my company, Genentech, and then how we define something that we call green biopharma, and sort of how we've been able to get it started here at our company. Okay, so what I just want to give you as a really quick background is that Genentech, we're a biotech company, about 15,000 employees, that started in South San Francisco, and we were recently fully purchased by Roche, a large global pharmaceutical company of over 80,000 employees, and with a long history and a much, we started out sort of as a California company, and now we've suddenly become a global company. And there's some, depending on who you talk to, there's some debate about who bought who, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you talk to. So some of the pieces I'd like to share with you is that we are a very strong mission-oriented corporate culture driven by science, innovation, and patience. It really is something that people care about in their work. It's not just a slogan. Just recently I was talking to a scientist about one of our blockbuster drugs, Herceptin, and he went out of his way to show us a video of some patients that he was working with on a new drug, Kadcyla, that we just also recently got approval for. And it was amazing because this scientist has been around for quite some time, and he still was very, very excited about the benefit that the patients were able to get from this new drug. So that was really neat to see this. I mean, he's kind of a big man on campus, and yet he was still very excited about the work that he's doing for patients. Our focus mainly is on oncology, immunology, and metabolism. We're moving into neuroscience, particularly things like Alzheimer's, and also infectious diseases. And of interest to the, to green chemistry, the Roche Group has committed to stay on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index in the top 3 tier among the healthcare arena. And the other thing I also want to mention is that we have an employee team here. It's called the Green Genes team. It's an employee volunteer team. And this slide is actually outdated. It's now 2,000 employees. So more than 10% of our 10% of the employees here on South San Francisco identify with being part of this green team, if you will, Green Genes team. And for those of you who aren't super familiar with the pharmaceutical business, I just wanted to mention that we're a very regulated industry, and so what happens is that we do a lot of work beforehand to get FDA approval, and once we have approval for a drug, we can then start commercially manufacturing and distributing our product. So think of clinical manufacturing, clinical development as making thousands of prototypes of a new product and being able to use that, being able to gather data for that we then give to the FDA, who will then approve as to whether or not we can go forward with a new product. So that means that shop floor innovations are usually very limited and have to be done within the context of the license that we have obtained from the FDA, which means that any changes that we want to make, it's much better to make them further upstream in the process, in the design process, rather than later after it's been commercialized, our product's been commercialized. Okay, so this is how we define green biopharma. It's very similar to the green chemistry definition. It's the design and development of and implementation of biological as well as chemical products and processes that reduce or eliminate our impact on the human health and environment. The main thing I want to mention here about our vision is that what we're trying to do here is reducing the ecological footprint of our core competencies, such as research and development and process development and manufacturing. We want to always present this as a way to innovate and not as restrictions necessarily, but as a challenge to innovate and to come up with new solutions. We want our innovations to be quantifiable, and this is sort of a way for us to build this bridge between patients, our employees, and the environment, and that's another way to kind of tie into our mission-oriented culture of the company. So how we got started at Genentech was we had what we call a Roche Technical Working Group, basically a Roche-wide working group of green chemists. And quite frankly, it's about a handful of process chemists who are interested in green chemistry. And we had about, they would sponsor a few lectures and have an annual process chemistry contest. Rather limited exposure to the rest of the company. It did not involve the sort of the biotech side of Genentech. It's only the more traditional pharmaceutical synthetic chemistry side of things, and not much of an organizational footprint in the company. So in terms of education and how that plays a role in changing companies, we were able to invite several green chemistry scientists from Berkeley who gave a sort of an informal lunch and learn talk as part of one of our Green Genes or Green Team events. And many people came, and people were super excited because up till now, we've had a really great sustainability program that focuses primarily on things like office recycling, composting, commute alternatives, and so on. And I think this is the first time that we were starting to really think about what it is that makes Genentech unique. And it's really more about our science and our process development and manufacturing. And I think this really hit a nerve with a lot of people. And so we were able to put together a sub-team, and then a sub-team of the green team. And so, for the longest time, I thought, okay, well, we'll just have this as a sub-team. We'll just kind of move this along. But I was able to get our leadership on board with taking a risk to develop this into an actual program. So what we did was we were able to develop a steering committee, and steering committee made of leaders from around the company to endorse a number of goals and projects around green biopharma. We have VP support from a very key, important department, our medicinal chemistry department. It's where most of our traditional pharmaceutical chemists reside. And then I also note that we were able to publish a video on this, and you might think that's kind of a funny thing to mention as an accomplishment or as on a timeline. Well, it turns out that publishing a video can be really impactful. I almost think of it almost as important as publishing, in a peer-reviewed journal, and we can talk about more about that later. The other thing that's also rather significant is that we also have a full-time person who's working on this right now as a regular employee, and so that's also a significant change to our company as well. Okay, so just to kind of let you know how we try to do this, try to implement green biopharma. This is kind of a busy slide, but basically it's a three-step model, if you will, and basically there's a scientific basis that we try to develop that helps answer the question, what can I do in my work that helps sustainability? And if you work in an office, that answer is pretty easy to find. Recycle, print double-sided, power down your devices, so on and so forth. But this question wasn't really easily answered until recently in the laboratory and also on the manufacturing floor. So up here, for the first one is we try to operationalize our environmental values in action. Help define what it is to be greener at one's work. So if you're in a lab, what does that mean? If you're in manufacturing, what does that mean? Once we define what that is, we want to present these as opportunities for innovation and diffuse these ideas within our target audience. And then thirdly, this is an important piece, is that when you make small changes to your behaviors, what we notice happening is that people start thinking about bigger things, like bigger, higher-level decision-making. For instance, if I care about recycling or if I care about using less water in an experiment, then after some time I'll start thinking about, well, wait a second, why am I even using this technology that uses so much water in the manufacturing floor? And so we've had these sort of light bulbs flash in a lot of people's heads. They start small, and they get these bigger and bigger ideas that kind of go higher up in the decision-making process, if you will. So if I can direct your attention to the lower half of the slide, here's an example. So, for instance, among the chemists, the scientific basis, or what does it mean to be a greener chemist? Well, in this particular case, we thought, if you had greener solvents, that would be a good thing. That would also, reduce the impact of your your work. And so, what does that mean? Well, we actually developed a medicinal chemistry. That's one of our departments here, a green task force, and we shared data on the different types of greener solvent alternatives out there. And so we had to get into the heads of our chemists to figure out, well, how do you decide what solvents do you use? I mean, what makes you think to use this solvent instead of that solvent? What's in your mental Rolodex of solvents, and how do you decide, I'm going to use DCM instead of this, or I'm going to use this particular material instead of that? So we're trying to get into people's heads to try to figure out why do they choose this solvent over others. And so we were able to find a handful of the greener solvents and that people decided to choose, and they tested them. They found them to be as good, if not better, than what they were using now. And so now we are at the point, in step 3, we're asking our suppliers to make these newer solvents more available. So that's one example with chemists. With our packaging engineers, they asked the same question, or we went to them and got them to ask the same question. How do we become greener packaging engineers? And so we said, why don't we try to come up with some sustainable packaging guidelines? And so in order to do that, we put together sort of an informal packaging engineering sub-team, came up with some guidelines. They already have these existing engineering guidelines, sort of an existing documentation system. We just are now, adding to that system as well. And so now we have greener packaging guidelines within our packaging engineering group, if you will. And then finally, my last example is here with our pilot plant. Again, the same example. How do I make, our pilot plant greener? What does that mean? How do we operationalize that? Well, one way is increasing recycling. We use lots of disposable materials in pilot plant. What can we do to try to increase our recycling? So we put together a team to look for solutions there within that community of practice, if you will. And now one of the things we're doing is we're working with one of our suppliers to come up with a rather novel take-back program. They sell us filters. We send them back dirty filters, and they can deal with them. The main thing I wanted to mention about these efforts is that anything that we do needs to be scientific and rationally and scalable. That is to say, we have a lot of scientists that we're dealing with, and scientists, by definition, are very skeptical. But they also want to do the right thing. They also want to be green. They recycle at home. They commute, and so they telecommute, or they use, public transit for commuting. So they're delighted to have the opportunity to do that in their work. The other thing I want to mention also is that we have to make sure that whatever change or alternative that we provide, they have to be superior. They have to be at the same level of performance, if not superior. Otherwise, people won't use them, and we'll lose a lot of momentum and credibility. So here's my last slide, and this is the original. If you'll notice, this is sort of original process flow of a pharmaceutical company. You know, you start with you find new molecules. You find out ways to manufacture it. You manufacture a batch of them for your clinical trials. You develop your clinical trials to test them out. Once you get FDA approval, you start commercially manufacturing them, and then you can start selling your product. And so this schematic just sort of demonstrates some of the projects that we have and where in the sort of core business of what we do these projects are appearing. Okay, so you can just have a look here. So just to kind of highlight a few, in discovery research, this is where we have the greener solvents. We have the discovery chemistry green team. We also have greener products. For instance, we have a substitute of a typical or very popular DNA gel stain. There's a very non-toxic substitute out there. So we work with some people to come up with some data to figure out, you know, how good of a substitute is this, and what situations can we use this in, what kinds of experiments can I use this for. We got that data out to people to try to encourage people to start using that. As a result, we are, you know, generating less hazardous waste, for instance. And then some other different types of things. Something I like to do in the future is to come up with better assays, better QC, you know, quality control methodologies that will use fewer solvents or less solvents, and thus create less waste. And so those are some examples of the different types of work that we're doing here. And I guess my last slide is here, just to kind of give you an idea of who is on our steering committee. So this is sort of at the senior engineer, director, senior manager level. We have folks from process development, folks from research, folks from manufacturing. We have endorsement from a sort of high up person, Bruce Ross. He happens to be the inventor of Lipitor, something I didn't know at the time when I first met him, which is good because otherwise I would have been all kind of cheesy around him when I first pitched this idea to him. And also, of course, many of our volunteer, our volunteer employee group, the Green Teams team, who've been involved as well. So my last slide, I think, is just to kind of mention that we do have this video. I invite you to have a look at it. It's only 3 minutes long. And it kind of gives you a nice sense of the passion and excitement that we have for this program. And that's it. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Tse-Sung. Great presentation, and now to wrap up our presentations, Andy Shafer from Elevance. Andy, welcome.
Thanks, Joel. So Elevance is a company that's probably not as well known as either HP or Genentech, so I'll start with a very brief background of who Elevance is. We are a specialty chemicals company. We make all of our products using renewable feedstocks and a technology known as olefin metathesis. That converts those feedstocks into both novel specialty chemicals as well as some traditional chemical intermediates. The company started in 2007 and is today about 150 employees. We have a world-scale plant operating in Indonesia producing these products, and just announced today that we're moving forward with our second biorefinery here in Natchez, Mississippi. So a big day for us as we continue to progress the company forward. But on the topic of green chemistry, I think this slide kind of depicted it well. If you look at the challenges that one might face trying to take this on, the odds can seem a little daunting to begin with. We've got to deliver a competitive product with performance benefits. We've got to, particularly if some of the comments that our previous speakers have made about replacing materials being expensive and looking for better solutions, it's got to at least be cost competitive with what's out there today. That requires a lot of things through the supply chain, from manufacturing and feedstocks all the way down to customers and regulatory requirements. So a rather daunting challenge to try and move forward against. But as both speakers have mentioned, there's a significant amount of opportunity here. And if you step back and look at it on a broad basis, it's affecting a wide variety of markets. and there are a number of reasons behind that. I think the sum total of this slide is that if you were looking for opportunity for growth, which much of the chemical industry is, there's certainly opportunities here to do that if you're willing to take on the challenges that I just mentioned before. So from an Elevance standpoint, as we look at this, we have some fundamental beliefs. The first belief is that we're building on the comments that both of the previous speakers have made, in that replacing materials is expensive, and therefore we believe that you've got to end up creating value, and that value has to be created through the whole chain. The only way to do that is to come forward with better products through the chain that end up delivering better products to consumers. You've got to be economical in this. It's got to be something that makes sense from a systems economic standpoint. And as Helen mentioned, you can't be creating other problems. So you've got to be dependable in terms of your ability to supply and the other challenges that you have, as well as having the smaller environmental footprint. But if you look at that, if most people start from how do I minimize the environmental footprint piece and then work toward the better products, we feel it's important to start with the better products and make sure that you're checking off the things that are critical in terms of environmental performance, that will have a better long-term impact throughout the supply chain and therefore enable more value creation and more success. And if you look at the petrochemical industry, this is an example from McKinsey of polymers. We believe that the innovation that's come out of the fossil building blocks, which are the primary sources of chemicals today, is fairly tapped in terms of innovation. Most of the novel materials were developed in the 20th century and kind of in the mid-20th century at that. And there's been a tremendous fall-off in innovation as industry is focused on cost and cost minimalization with the first oil crisis in the early 80s. And that's led to an effect that we haven't seen better products and breakthroughs in quite a while. And so from that standpoint, there's opportunity here to look for other sources that can provide innovation and therefore the better performance that I mentioned in the previous slide. The other aspect of this that I think is important to consider is if you look at the petrochemical industry, in the early years of the petrochemical industry, the feedstock portion of it was a relatively small component of the total cost to manufacture the product. The processing costs were substantial. And as the petrochemical industry matured, those processing costs were affected considerably as industry drove those costs down with a number of innovations in processing, in addition to innovations in product. And today, it's become rather incremental. The overall industry is one that's highly efficient, does a great job at converting feedstocks into products, and there's not a lot of additional gains that can be made from squeezing processing of traditional products. So what you're left with then is a cost structure that is entirely or significantly dependent on the feedstock fluctuations, which we all know are highly volatile and generally trending in one direction. On the other hand, the renewables industry is much like what the chemical industry was, the petrochemical industry was in its early years. It has a high component of processing costs while we're learning how to effectively convert those renewable feedstocks into materials that deliver the other aspects of the value propositions that I've talked about. And we see the same trend is one that will likely happen as we figure out which products we want to go after and what the best way to process those are. So even though renewable feedstocks can be volatile, the ability to long-term send a trend that is a cost reduction trend is much more possible and plausible than what might be there in petrochemicals today, which is another reason to pay attention to these kinds of industries, another reason why companies may want to invest in this space. So with that as a background to some fundamental beliefs that we have and why this is an interesting way to go after it, what I'll talk about for the next couple of slides is our approach to how we're doing this. We think it's pretty critical that you focus on what are the performance aspects that are necessary that enable our customers or even downstream of that to address their critical customer needs. And those are very specific by market, by segment in many cases. And so you have to get detailed and get into the marketplace and understand what those opportunities are. And we've spent a great degree of time, effort, and energy working with customers and talking with them about what it is that delivers value in their sectors and what are the performance properties that need to go with that. That has to be coupled with making sure that we combine those into markets that create enough scale for us to effectively build world-scale facilities and get the benefits of scale that are possible. And so at Elevance, we've focused on 3 very large product markets and 2 large intermediate areas where our chemicals are traded on more of a global basis, where the functionality is more the chemistry rather than the market performance. So we think both the critical market needs and the market sizes are things that you have to pay attention to. The way that we focus on performance is through some of the novel chemistry that we can access. If you look at the specialty chemicals industry, there are really the petrochemical industry, which is heavily focused on olefins on the right-hand side of the chart, and the other part of the chemical industry today is typical oleochemicals, which are either esters or acids, as depicted on the top right-hand side. What our technology enables us to do is put both of those functional handles on the same carbon chain. And that gives us a tool that industry has not had at a cost-effective way to be able to address chemical problems in the past. And with that, then, we can get to this chemical building block in the middle that we refer to as our inherent 9DA. In this case, it's the acid version that's shown there. And that product can go into many of the traditional petrochemical processes as a new building block and enable then either shorter pathways or more efficient pathways to existing products, or pathways that didn't exist before to novel products that can provide performance that was before unachievable. Both of those areas are areas that we're spending time with our customers and that they're taking advantage of as we move forward. But it's not just the chemistry that you have to pay attention to. In addition to the chemistry, you also have to pay attention to the supply chain, as Helen mentioned, I think, in her talk. So we're paying attention not only to the right side of this with the product mix and the product performance and what's out there on product needs or supply. We're also paying attention to what are the manufacturing aspects of this that are necessary to pay attention to, low capital, low operating costs, and scale, as well as what feedstocks are available to do this on. And paying attention to that entire supply chain, even within our microcosm, is important. I would say that it's equally important across the entire range of value chain players, and I'll talk about that more in a second. So from a feedstock standpoint, one of the things that Elevance has paid attention to with our technology is how can we access widely available and feedstocks that are both locally available so that we can minimize the footprint transporting them around, as well as something that can be transported relatively easily. Some of the renewable feedstocks you get into mass or bulk areas where you have very light materials that are difficult to ship around, or they're grown in certain regions of the world and therefore not available on a global basis, which creates other challenges in terms of how to make these things efficient across the whole supply chain. We're paying attention to that with our feedstocks and how we look at our plants. For example, our plant in Southeast Asia is operating on palm. It is the most readily available oilseed crop in Southeast Asia. That's the primary source of palm in the world today. Our plant in Mississippi will operate either on canola or soy. All of our plants can operate on any of the oils listed, but the ability to operate with something local is a tremendous advantage in our view. So finally, the last piece on approach is to look at how we approach this from a business model standpoint. We look for opportunities to leverage complementary assets and capabilities so that we can accelerate time to market, because as has already been mentioned a couple of times, there's an investment required here, and the sooner you can get an investment to pay off and start returning value instead of consuming cost, the better off you are. In addition, what we want to also do is reduce development time and risk, and So by doing that, we believe that business is built by a community. It's much like raising a child. It's a community event, not just an individual company event. And so we've looked to partner in feedstocks and technology, in manufacturing, and in markets to address those three bullets that are at the bottom of the slide that I've mentioned. We think that approach to the marketplace is one that's very important and helps all the parties benefit. But as we move forward with this, I guess I'll finish by saying that there are a number of challenges here for companies on the webinar to consider. First of all, regulatory challenges are not insignificant. By definition, markets favor and benefit incumbent technologies. They're the ones that have been qualified for use already. They typically don't have to make new investment in continuing to update their status from a regulatory standpoint. Once they're grandfathered in, they're in a pretty good place. All of the new innovative materials that the companies on the webinar today are talking about are things that have to go through some level of regulatory scrutiny and clearance. And the more that those can be based on equal footing with incumbents, the more that we can take advantage of the benefits that these new products can bring to the marketplace throughout the supply chain and across the different areas of benefit, whether it's environmental, performance, or economic. Second point I would make is, as I pointed out before, connecting the value chain is one that we think helps make things move faster and reduce risk for all the parties. But that's challenging. It's challenging in a number of ways. We're often quite aligned on priorities within our value chain, and they're, by definition, company by company, not necessarily industry sector by industry sector or market by market, which makes it difficult to align priorities, to align on what needs or benefits we can deliver or accept, and to find non-competitive ways to do this that share value in a way that people can accept. So translating the value chain benefits across the value chain is one that is not easy, which brings me to the bullet point about business development skills. For this to move forward, it's really one of changing mindsets. It's not a mindset of sales or buyer. It's got to be a mindset of how can we do this in a way that creates value for all the parties in a way that represents both the investment and the risk that they're taking on. And that experience is fairly limited in people in the marketplace. There are not many industries that have been focused on development. There are not many individuals whose careers have been built around it. There's been much more focus, particularly in the last 25 years, on costs. And therefore, those skills are ones that are in great need and high value across trying to implement some of the things we've been talking about today. Which leads us to leadership. I think leadership is necessary both at a company and an individual level. It's both internal and external. And by that, we need people who can connect the value chain, who can find ways to facilitate co-investment and collaboration, who can create innovative business models and adjust and balance risk-taking across the value chain and across their companies. And that takes leadership at all levels, which is an ongoing challenge to make this happen. So those are some of the things that we see at Elevance and that we're working on daily. Happy to shift this back to Joel and move to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. I think just a great set of presentations. Helen really talking about the key to educating their suppliers of their needs and linking to other criteria, performance economic criteria in that green chemistry space. Tse-Sung talking about the internal change model and really creating behavioral change through a team approach, and then Andy talking about really that link to customers and you know, the focus on performance for customers to meet particular needs. So it's just a great set of presentations that look at different tools and approaches to education. Let me ask a question actually from Tse-Sung to Andy. What he sees as the ethical and environmental risks of relying on natural feedstocks. So how does Elevance deal with those sustainability issues of its feedstock selection?
it's a great question. A couple of things. One is we look at not only the current but also the future, and we see that there are opportunities for future feedstocks, whether they're algal or jatropha, those kinds of feedstocks that are more industrial as opposed to food-based, where the feedstocks today are heavily oriented, as being possibilities that we would like to move to in the future. We also look, and I've yet to find the perfect feedstock for anything. Any feedstock that I look at from anything that's in the chemical industry today has a number of challenges with it. And so I think part of what we have to do is look both across the feedstocks at their impact, so transportation, extraction, all of those, as well as within a feedstock class, how can we minimize those impacts and work on both aspects of that as we go forward.
Right, Andy, a follow-on to that. As you look at the toxicity of the chemicals based on bio-based feedstocks, is there a difference in the toxicity between those and the petrochemical that you're substituting?
Difficult question to answer on a generic basis because I'm not sure what petrochemical feedstocks they might be talking about, but at a fundamental basis, all chemicals have some level of toxicity, whether it's water or something else. So it's a matter of what's the appropriate level of the product and the appropriate use of it. Many of the products that we're making from renewable feedstocks have far less toxicity than petrochemical counterparts, but that on a generic basis is a really tough question to answer.
Great, thank you. A question for Helen. Is HP using only hazard assessment tools, or are you also looking at risk assessment tools for limiting unintended consequences?
HP uses a variety of tools that we put together into what we call an integrated assessment protocol. Hazard screening is up front. It's the first step, but we actually look at life cycle assessment as well as risk assessment as part of that decision. So we do use a lot of different ways of looking at the different materials. We don't want to have unintended consequences. And then we actually trigger more extensive investigations if we have a reason to think that there's something there. So if we do a screening, let's just say you found something that had a skin sensitivity and it's a sensitizer, and that material was going to be used in a customer accessible part, that actually would trigger like an exposure assessment. So we actually do have a wide range of things that we look at. But hazard screening is very important to us. It does sit at the very beginning of the process. And we found that that actually is a pretty good balance, not only for sort of practical purposes, because hazard screening tends to be a lot faster and easier than some of the later LCA and risk assessment type methods, so we can do that up front before we invest. But then also in cases like life cycle where we're looking for burden shifting, what we like to do is remove the most hazardous options from the table from consideration, so that when you're looking at a life cycle decision, so say you can save a liter of water if you use something that's slightly more toxic than another choice. You don't really want to have plutonium on the table as one of your options. But if you have something that is only a very small difference, then it might make sense. So we remove all of the options that are equally hazardous to what we're getting rid of before you get into a case of life cycle assessment, because life cycle assessment doesn't have any checks or balances to stop that. It's perfectly acceptable in life cycle assessment to do that, to save a liter of water by using plutonium. So we try to avoid putting people in that position where they have to make a decision like that or make a trade-off like that. So again, hazard's very important. It's really where we place it is more of a safeguard for that burden shifting, that assessment that we would do at the end. But we still are looking at risk, exposure, and life cycle.
Thanks, Helen. Just a quick follow-on question to that question. What tools does HP use for life cycle assessment?
We have standard, we use CIMAPRO, but we also have a database that's a consolidation of several different databases that we use for internal assessments. We have on my team, on the Global Environmental Materials team, we have access to some very good life cycle analysts who can do things quickly for us inside. We don't always necessarily publish all of that work, but we do have experts who that's what they do, is focus on life cycle assessments.
Great, thank you, Helen. Let me ask the whole panel a broad question about green chemistry education. If you look at sort of the tools that work best in terms of educating internally or your supply chain, both your suppliers and your customers, can each of you sort of reflect for a minute on what's worked best? What have you learned from your education efforts if for other firms to take into their own efforts of, where to start and what's been most successful? And maybe we could start with you, Tse-Sung.
Thank you. I think in our particular situation, we had sort of this latent demand, sort of this pent-up demand to bring our sustainability efforts into the laboratory and into the manufacturing floor. So just by knowing that there was a there, if you will, just by knowing that there are scientific principles or rationally defensible principles behind green chemistry, I think was enough to get people excited and say, oh, well, I certainly can do this in my lab. I certainly can do this. So the American Chemistry Society, Chemical Society, ACS, the American Chemistry Society, they have a Green Chemistry Institute. They have a lot of materials that are available for people, for both from academia and to industry. So that was, I think, something very helpful. Seeing something like the Solvent Selection Guide was also very helpful. And then seeing that other people are doing it, our peer companies are doing it as well. So those your peer companies, if they're doing it, then you should be doing it. And also knowing that there is a scientific basis for what you're doing. I think that's been very important for us.
Great. Helen?
Yeah, so HB has a formal training matrix for environmental topics in general, including green materials. The majority of people get training, though, and it's based on what role they have, but the majority of people get training to become educated consumers of information from our suppliers so that they know what they're looking at and know how to respond to it. So how to use the procurement guides that I had mentioned before. Or what to do if something's not on the procurement guideline, how do you get something assessed by our team, things like that. So that's one side of it. So it's not so much we're not taking procurement engineers and teaching them how to be chemists for the most part. We're mostly helping them to recognize what to look for and what to ask for. With our suppliers, we actually do encourage them to do direct training like Green Screen. We usually we bring this up in our normal supplier meetings and then encourage them to do it. And we try to do that by commodity type or by material type so that we're working kind of all in the same space. So, for example, with our flux vendors, we have very good relationships with them, and we have and they do, of course, a lot of chemistry. So we bring these ideas to them, encourage them to do it, and that lays the foundation for then when we change our technical specs to, say, require that type of assessment, they're prepared for it. And so there's a lot of education. And the great part about it is that what we found is that there's a lot of receptivity towards it. A lot of times they just don't know about it. So there's just a lot of information sharing of what's available, encouraging them to do their own research, and a lot of times they will go out and educate themselves. Although we, again, will do training if we need to.
Great, Helen. Thank you. Andy?
I would say that ours are less formal in terms of the experiences that we've had. There are many cases where helping people understand what's possible and how did we get here, how did things develop, the history of evolution of the petrochemical industry, and providing background data and beliefs and models somewhat similar to what I showed in some of my early slides has been really helpful for people to grasp, gee, there is a way that we can do this that is different. So giving them that possibility piece has often been the first part of it. And then from there, I find the simple tools become ones that people can grab very easily in their day jobs. Things around discussion of the triple bottom line and how those three legs of the stool work together, the 12 principles of green chemistry, just those basics are oftentimes where we need to start with many people that are either in the lab, in the purchasing offices, or interfacing in some way that's not directly a internal functional area of the company.
Great, thank you. Let me ask one last question, then we'll wrap up. As many people on the call know, the GC3 created a policy statement from businesses on the need for green chemistry education, which talks about companies preferentially hiring, all things equal, chemists and business managers, designers that have some background in green chemistry, toxicology, environmental science. So the question is, do you have in your companies any kind of preferential hiring for people who have green chemistry knowledge? And if not, do you have are you finding hires that come in with that sort of knowledge, or are you having to create programs to educate them in life cycle thinking, green chemistry, safer alternatives, et cetera? We could start with you, Helen.
Hi, actually, yeah, we do hire people specifically with that background, and in fact, on this call today, we have two of our staff members that were specifically chosen because of their interest and background in green chemistry. One of them is actually a product of the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry. So we do take that very seriously in that hiring, decision. Of course, in all hiring, it's complicated. There's a lot of factors there. But, yeah, we are looking for people with those skills.
Great. Tse-Sung?
Well, as you probably can tell, our program is relatively new, so I wish I could say that, our scientists are looking for people with a green chemistry background, but it's probably much more honest to say that they're probably not. But that said, one thing we notice is that people, I don't know if this really answers the question, but we know that people who want to work here, especially people of the quote-unquote millennial generation, they expect you to have a pretty strong sustainability program. And so, it turns out that our HR and corporate relations folks are really excited about these programs because it's a way for us to really keep the excitement up for recruiting. So right now we're not necessarily looking for people, we don't explicitly say we're looking for people with a green chemistry background. I think it would probably help your application. And we are kind of hearing and expecting it a lot. So I don't think it would be a bad thing at all, of course. It would only help.
Great, thank you. Andy?
I would definitely agree that we have challenges finding people that have the basic understanding of many of these concepts. As you might imagine, we need to find people who come first with the strong scientific chemistry skills as we're building an organization. We've hired both people who've been in industry for a long time, as well as new folks straight out of college. And quite often, their experiences haven't included the detailed rigor of these kind of backgrounds. So we're teaching a lot of that as we go here.
Great, thank you so much, Andy. Let me thank once again our speakers, Helen, Tse-Sung, and Andy, for their wonderful presentations and insights. So thank you very much again for attending.